They say that the only limit to your creativity is your imagination, but within the world of video games, that's not strictly true. Your massive world, your gargantuan graphic demands, and the huge asks from your team are all well and good, but what if they're too much for the console to even handle? These releases are all unique, but come together under one unifying banner. How the hell did you manage that? I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 impossible video games that shouldn't exist. Number 10. Resident Evil 2, Nintendo 64. Capcom's long-awaited sequel to their survival horror classic is often celebrated as one of the best games in the Resident Evil series and in the PlayStation library. It was so good that Nintendo wanted a piece of the undead pie, and Capcom, never shy to consider any and all port options, just ask Resident Evil 4, didn't back down from the challenge. On average, PlayStation discs hold around 700 megabytes of data, and Resident Evil 2 in particular used 2 of them. Admittedly, this was more to do with high-fidelity audio and full-motion videos. Either way, the ask to bring this game to the Nintendo 64 was bold, considering that the system's cartridges had a maximum space of 500 megabytes. Capcom hired Angel Studios, now known as Rockstar San Diego, to see if it was even possible. Over the course of 18 months, the team managed to reduce the game to fit all 4 campaign scenarios, plus the unlockable hunk and tofu modes, down to fit onto a single Nintendo 64 cartridge. That would be impressive enough, but the game also featured the only official item randomizer in Resident Evil series history. Whilst the N64 version of the game is definitely a downgrade in audio and visual fidelity, for the console to be able to run one of the PlayStation's heaviest hitters was no easy feat. Number 9. The Elder Scrolls 3, Morrowind, Xbox. The Elder Scrolls 3 coming to Xbox was a very big deal in 2002. Having such a storied franchise on Microsoft's new home console was a great move, but it seemed unthinkable that such a thing was even doable. An RPG of the size that Morrowind promised to be was surely only possible on powerful PCs of the time. Apparently not, and the Xbox version became one of the console's best sellers for over a year. Best of all, it skimped on the content in no way. It was every bit as deep as its PC counterpart, and whilst it may not be a looker by modern standards, its world is so expansive that players are still finding secrets today. In fact, in an Xbox podcast in 2020, Bethesda director Todd Howard shockingly revealed that the team had taken advantage of a neat trick to get the Xbox version to run. Morrowind was infamous for its long load times, but Howard slyly revealed that they often served a purpose as they were rebooting the Xbox system without the player's knowledge. By temporarily storing the game's state somewhere and then refreshing the console, it cleared the system's memory cache. Without such a quirk, it's likely that the game wouldn't run at all, as Morrowind's gigantic world being held in the console memory would have surely led to crashes. Number 8. God of War, PlayStation 4. The 2018 revival of God of War rejuvenated the Sony series, put Kratos in an exciting new world, and won a ton of awards. It was heralded as a cinematic masterpiece for gaming. To make Dad of Boy stand out from its contemporaries, Cory Barlog, the game's director, wanted to do something that had not only never been done before in video games, but was rarely seen in cinema. In order to create something unique that truly invested players in the journey of Kratos and Atreus, he wanted God of War to be one continuous shot. This meant no loading screens, no fading to black, and more importantly, no camera cuts whatsoever. It also meant all motion capture had to be done perfectly, since editors couldn't splice together the best parts of different performances, and cutscenes and gameplay had to blend seamlessly every time. Dori Arazi, director of photography for the game, described his first reaction to the proposal as impossible from both technical and artistic perspectives. A lot of gamers didn't necessarily notice what God of War was doing, but according to Barlog, nearly half his colleagues who had doubted him along the way realised the majesty of what they had crafted when they finally experienced the finished product. Number 7. V-Rally 3, Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was a strange one because the home console market had abandoned 2D almost completely during the time of the console's release, and so the system was left in a weird space. Many developers designed games with a 3D look and feel for the GBA, but it was V-Rally 3 that was the first watershed moment. Developed by VD Dev to tie into V-Rally 3's release on home systems, this handheld port built on the developer's previous 3D work on the Game Boy Color and pushed beyond the typical Mode 7 affair of other GBA races like F-Zero and Mario Kart. V-Rally 3 was gorgeous in 2002, visually striking and packed with complex textures and sprite work, whether that was from behind the vehicle or even from the surprising addition of the cockpit view. Most refer to the Game Boy Advance as a high-powered Super Nintendo, but these graphics were more on par with Sony's PlayStation. It really says a lot about how wowed the press were with this adaptation that Eurogamer scored the PS2 V-Rally 3 a very middling 5, but this technical marvel was honoured with an 8 out of 10. Developers took notice and 3D races started to crop up on the system, but few could hold a candle to V-Rally 3. Number 6. Pokemon Gold and Silver, Game Boy. When Pokemon exploded across Japan and then the world in the mid to late 1990s, Game Freak found themselves a victim of their own success. As a small team that only had 4 programmers, they were snowed under with Pokemon projects, reworking the original Red and Green versions, making a spin-off game for the N64, and naturally the true Game Boy sequels Gold and Silver. However, before anything could be done, they had to fix Pokemon's code. The original games, despite being worked on for 5 years, were held together by a complex system which was ultimately flawed, riddled with errors, and thus manifested all kinds of bugs and glitches. Seeing the plight of Game Freak, HAL Laboratory president and former WizKid programmer Satoru Iwata volunteered his help. In 2 weeks, Iwata had deconstructed and recompiled the mess of cables that was the Pokemon battle system, something that the game's team had struggled to make any headway on. And then from there, Iwata compressed the system's data down so much that Pokemon sequels could contain a lot more content. With the late great Iwata stepping in to clear up the mess, Pokemon Gold and Silver was suddenly able to be twice the size of the original games with 100 fewer bugs. Number 5. Rise of the Tomb Raider, Xbox 360. As is the nature of games that emerge around the time of a new system launch, it's often the case that they are released cross-generation. In recent years, there's been much discussion about games holding back the most up-to-date system from a technical point so that they can work at all on previous hardware. Rise of the Tomb Raider, when it released in 2015, was an Xbox exclusive that stylish design principles and beautiful lighting setup showed the power of the Xbox One. So what did this mean for the Xbox 360 version released day and date? It certainly was less of a step down than expected, considering in the years leading to its release, previous gen versions of the likes of Far Cry 4 and Shadow of Mordor had famously suffered. Rise had been ported down to the 360 by Nixxes Software and lost precisely 0 of the Xbox One's content in any way, running with nary a hiccup. There was a visual difference, but for a console that was at this time 8 years old, to be able to run the game anywhere near close to the Xbox One version was a total surprise. It was clearly the inferior of the two, but not by the wider margin expected, and considering the huge install base of the Xbox 360, it was a shrewd business move that actually paid off. Number 4. Star Fox, Super Nintendo. In 1993, Nintendo released Star Fox, causing the jaws of consumers to drop wide open. It might seem incredibly quaint now, but considering that home consoles had never seen anything quite like this in the third dimension before, it was a revelation. After all, the Super Nintendo hadn't been built for 3D, and the technology was, of course, a whole other generation away. Star Fox was the brainchild of a partnership between Nintendo and Argonaut Software, who had previously made the Starglider games for Amiga. Nintendo saw the potential and wanted their own spin on this, but after internally porting their Starglider prototype to the SNES, Argonaut admitted that this is the best we can do without dedicated hardware. Nintendo wouldn't take no for an answer, however, and instead dreamt up the Super FX chip that would come installed into the cartridge of some Super Nintendo games. Cleverly utilising unused pins on the cartridge, it would push the console's capabilities beyond Nintendo's original design specs. This first ever 3D processor in a consumer product allowed the Super Nintendo, a system that typically ran 2D titles, to render 3D polygons. And with it, Star Fox was born. Very few other games used the Super FX chip, but Nintendo was willing to go the extra mile to realise Miyamoto and Argonaut Software's vision. Number 3. Crash Bandicoot, PlayStation. Whilst he might not get necessarily the same dues as Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog, Crash Bandicoot is responsible for a great many things. His first outing in 1996 put Naughty Dog on the map, crafted the earliest blueprint for 3D platforming games, and helped to make the original PlayStation a huge success. However, the team had a very specific creative concept for Crash and his world, as stylized on the stretchy American cartoon design rather than the awkward robotic 3D movement of video games at the time. The memory demands of this were more than the PlayStation was built to handle. Thus, experts at their craft, the team at Naughty Dog, led by co-founder Andy Gavin, got to work at seeing what they could push out of the new system. Typically, the console would load a lump sum of 2 MB off the disk to use at any given moment, refreshing these between loading screens. Essentially hacking the hardware, the team taught the console's memory units to read a series of smaller packages of data instead. This allowed the game to fetch only what it needed at that moment, with these packages alternating as the player moved around the level. It allowed Crash to have the smooth, unique, high-fidelity visual style that it did, and revolutionised how consoles would read data moving forward. Number 2. Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, Nintendo Switch. Nintendo has never been the company that rides the crest of the latest technology for graphics or even necessarily performance, preferring instead to focus on features. As such, the Nintendo Switch's specs weren't really comparable to the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, and in fact its Nvidia Tegra T210 chipset was already 2 years old when the system launched. However, in recent years, the Nintendo Switch has become home to a slew of surprising ports such as Mortal Kombat, Doom, and perhaps the most impressive of them all, Witcher 3. The secret isn't in the hardware, but rather the software and Nintendo's willingness to do their best to accommodate developers and their needs. As such, Witcher 3, one of the biggest and most detail-heavy open-world games of the modern era, is somehow squeezed onto a 32GB Nintendo Switch cartridge. There's no getting around the fact that the Switch version suffers with texture pop-ins and lower resolution graphics, but the fact that this game even runs at all is a miracle of design. Featuring all the right lighting and reflections and running a stable pace makes Witcher 3 perhaps the boldest and most impressive Nintendo Switch game on the system, and considering it was designed for high-end PCs, it's a pretty incredible achievement. Number 1. Doom, Super Nintendo. When the FPS game-changer Doom first arrived, it was head and shoulders above anything else at the time. Thus began the competitive nature of programmers to port the shooter to anything with a processor, which in more recent years has got as zany as Doom running on calculators or even Microsoft Notepad. All of these of course are impressive in their own ways, but when it comes to traditional ports, the Super Nintendo version holds a very special place for being truly ambitious. The numbers alone say it all. The PC specifications for Doom at the time were a 66MHz CPU and 8MB of RAM. The SNES had fractions of this with only a 21MHz CPU and a measly 128KB of RAM. Ergo, this port should have been impossible. Doom on SNES is mocked for somewhat understandable reasons because it's missing levels and it's consistently ugly, but the fact it exists at all is worth commendation. Better yet, it has more levels than the Sega 32X version, and they're all based on the original PC file, so all of the geometry is accurate, unlike the PlayStation version. To save the best until last, if you and a friend both owned the console, a copy of Doom, and a SNES X-Band modem, you could play online multiplayer Doom on the Super Nintendo in 1995. Take a bow, you severely weird port. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and whilst you're there, let us know which of these you were most impressed by, and of course any other video games that you can think of that simply just shouldn't exist because of how impressive they are, be they first releases or amazing ports. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.